My name is Michael Penn. I teach in the Stanford Religious Studies Department. I want to welcome you to the second of 5 Ptarmigan mini lectures that are taking place this winter and spring. The series showcases senior as well as exceptional junior faculty. But instead of delivering a traditional research talk, we've asked participants to use the classroom lecture as their model. Our goal is to make discrete aspects of late antiquity accessible to specialists and non-specialists alike. And due to Zoom fatigue, to do that in exactly 1 hour. As a result, I'll give an incredibly brief speaker introduction. Most importantly, during the presentation, please take advantage of the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Anuja Amin, one of our department's PhD students who has overseen this series, will curate submitted questions and present them to our speaker. Now on to today's speaker. Reyhan Durmaz is an assistant professor of religious studies at the University of Pennsylvania. A recent PhD from Brown, her first book, Beyond Hagiography, Stories Between Christianity and Islam in the Middle Ages, is already under contract. This evening, she'll be speaking to us on the topic of Syriac architecture. Please.
Thank you very much, Professor Pan, for the kind introduction and for the wonderful invitation. I'm so happy and excited to be here. I would also like to thank Anuj Amin, who has been fantastic in organizing this event. I will extend my thanks to Stanford Religious Studies Department for making these conversations possible, and my greetings to everybody who is joining us today. I will share my slides. All right, here we are. So I will begin with a short news article. You know, the Pope's recent visit to Iraq has put the Christian communities in the Middle East to the headlines of Western media these days. And I thought we could also begin with similar news from Iraq. The news was that the monastery of Mar Behnam near Mosul was rebuilt after a violent destruction of the site by ISIS. The article includes 3 photographs: the new door of the monastic church, the tomb of Mar Behnam in the background, and you see the octagonal building with the gold-colored dome. And on the right, we see a stonemason carving a floral pattern. So this is a significant turn in the history of the Christian community in Mosul and of this building that has been standing for a millennium, if not longer. By the end of this lecture, you will know more about the history of this site and how it fits within the broader development of Syriac architecture. In this lecture, I will first give an overview of the late antique ecclesiastical architecture of the Near East. This will give us the broader context to situate Syriac architecture. Then we will explore some of the major features of Syriac churches, after which I will say a few words about the major material and literary sources for the study of Syriac architecture. And we will wrap up with a brief overview of the scholarship. As you all know, Syriac is a dialect of the Aramaic language, and Syriac-speaking Christians are attested in literary sources roughly from the early 4th century. Now, following the Council of Ephesus in 431 and the Council of Chalcedon in 451, Christian communities, the majority of which were Syriac-speaking Christians, separated from the Byzantine Imperial Church, which is later called the Greek Orthodox Church. These separations in the 5th century resulted in the establishment of Syriac churches' clerical hierarchies and distinct liturgies. As you can tell from this rather simplistic but still confusing slide, Syriac Christianity is a broad category by which we refer to East and West Syriac Rite. And under these 2 groups, there are Orthodox as well as Catholic churches. So you can already sense the problem with the term Syriac architecture. Today, I will mostly focus on the Church of the East, which is also known as the Nestorian Church, and I will speak about the Syrian Orthodox Church, known as the Jacobite or the Monophysite Church, but we will also refer to other Syriac-speaking communities. Chronologically, we will begin with the 4th century and stop somewhere around the 12th century. Geographically, we will be in the Near East, where these 2 Syriac churches emerged in the 5th century. This region developed a rich and diverse architectural tradition in late antiquity, the time period roughly from the 4th to the 7th century. So the classical, that is the Hellenistic and early Roman buildings, such as the temples at Baalbek and Palmyra, are well known to many of us. But the late antique Christian architecture of the region is relatively less studied. Syria and Mesopotamia provide an unequaled number of churches for the study of early Christian architecture, and there is exciting recent scholarship in the field, as we will see shortly. In late antiquity, back to the blank map here, this was a wealthy and densely populated region, housing numerous communities with different religious and linguistic backgrounds. The region connected the political capital, Constantinople, and the topmost pilgrimage center, Jerusalem, which, while also being in the cultural orbit of metropoles and ecclesiastical centers such as Antioch, Seleucia Ctesiphon, and Alexandria further to the west. The monumental expressions of architecture, in a way, radiated from these centers to the Syrian and Mesopotamian countryside. The ecclesiastical architecture of the region, on the one hand, was modeled on the churches and martyria built in these centers, following the Edict of Milan in 312. And on the other hand, it spatially and formally incorporated the earlier pagan temples. In other words, the urban forms were often localized and scaled down in the countryside, depending on the building materials and socioeconomic factors. Moreover, most of the Near East was on the Roman-Persian frontier in late antiquity. Therefore, the military activity and cultural encounters in the region were also important factors in the development of its architectural traditions. As a result of these dynamics, a rich architectural and aesthetic vocabulary developed in the Near East in late antiquity. Numerous churches, monasteries, baptisteries, martyria, pilgrims' hotels, and other buildings dotted the landscape from the late 4th to the 6th century. Some of these buildings were imperially funded, while others funded by local patrons. Some were built upon previously pagan sites, while others were built anew. Despite this variety, when put side by side, late antique churches in Syria display a number of common features. For example, as you see here, the solid stone masonry is prominent in these buildings, thanks to the locally available limestone and basalt. So some of these buildings, like the famous Martyrion at Kalat Sim'an, have a cruciform central ground plan. And central plan churches are known to have been built in Antioch, Jerusalem, and Constantinople in the 4th century. So we see the continuation of those urban forms. But the majority of the Near Eastern churches have elongated rectangular naves with an apse and often side chambers on the east end. The naves of the buildings are usually flanked by side aisles, and they are separated by archivolts resting on piers or columns. Here we see these 3 arches separating the nave of the church from the northern aisle. Entrances to the churches are either on the south or they are on the west, depending on the orientation of the church. And they are often marked by decorated arches and lintels. Here are 2 entrances to this church. We are looking at the southern wall here. This church was probably for women, and the slightly bigger and slightly more decorated entrance is for men. And we have a 3rd entrance in this case, which was probably for the use of the clergy. Arched windows are also common in Syrian architecture, as we see both on the apse here and here on the eastern wall. Most of the buildings were vaulted with timber, often decorated with brickwork, but in general, the use of timber and brick seemed to be limited. All right, so the decorations of these churches preserve the classical styles with varying degrees of innovation. For example, in the 4th century basilica in Rusafa, the columns separating the nave from the side aisles are decorated with acanthus leaves, well known in the region from Hellenistic and early Roman buildings. Here is a collage of acanthus leaves from churches in Syria built between the 4th and the 6th centuries, just to give you a glimpse of the variety. Some of them are uncut, as we see in these 3 examples, while others are very detailed and they incorporate crosses, monograms, and in this instance, we even have a Syriac inscription. Let's look at another important late antique building. The Cathedral of Jacob of Nisibis was built in the 4th century. The cathedral has been lost, but the baptistry is still functioning as a church today. The building has intricate decorations both on the exterior and in the interior, and these ornamented bands, as we see in this close-up, embellish the door frames. The detail is quite stunning here. Here is another photograph of the interior of the baptistry. The ornamented bands continue along the arches, and the pier capitals are decorated with garlanded and carved acanthus leaves. So the examples show that there was a Syrian idiom of church architecture, and these buildings were used by Syriac-speaking Christians, as literary and epigraphic evidence verify. But to what extent can we speak about Syriac architecture in late antiquity? Let's go back to the timeline of ecclesiastical developments for a moment. As these churches and many others were built in late antiquity, in the 5th century, the Church of the East and the Syrian Orthodox Church separated from those that accepted the councils of Ephesus and Chalcedon. So the liturgical map of the Near East was changing. But these developments were not reflected on architecture immediately. The earliest churches and monasteries that were built by and for liturgically distinct Syriac communities can be perhaps placed at the beginning of the 6th century. And the architecture of these buildings are interesting in that there is not much that distinguishes them from the churches used by non-Syriac Christian communities. For example, the main church of the monastery of Mar Gabriel in northern Mesopotamia looked like this: a rectangular space elongated on a north-south axis. The entrance is on the west, here it is, and the sanctuary is right here, framed with a rectangular frame and a decorated arch. The 4 arched windows that we see, as we've seen before, are common in Syrian churches. The monastic church and the other adjacent buildings here display fine brickwork familiar from Byzantine architecture. The church also has gold mosaics covering the sanctuary, dated with a Greek-Syriac bilingual inscription to the 6th century. Thus, one of the earliest examples of Syriac architecture is at the intersection of Byzantine, Syrian, and Syriac architecture. Mar Gabriel was an imperially funded building, so it is problematic to describe the state of Syriac architecture through the lens of this building in the 6th century. Since by this time period there were liturgically distinguished Christian communities, we may presume that there was some separation and contestation of space. But the surviving evidence does not allow us to identify a distinct Syriac architectural tradition. Archaeological evidence, in fact, points at liturgical and other spaces shared by Greek-speaking and Syriac-speaking communities, especially in monasteries, pilgrimage sites, and martyrs' shrines. So perhaps there were churches built specifically for the use of Syriac-speaking Christians in villages, but the surviving material evidence tells a story of shared spaces between various Christian groups for the 6th century. In the 7th century, the Islamic conquests and other economic, environmental, and social changes in the Near East are often taken as a turning point. But the overall state of church architecture does not qualify as a period of decline in this century. Restoration, repair, and expansion of buildings continued, and in some rural areas, new churches were built shortly after the Islamic conquests. Many of the surviving examples of Syriac architecture come from the 7th and 8th centuries. For example, the monastery of Jacob the Recluse that we are looking at here was extensively rebuilt in the 8th century. The foundation stories, such as the story of Behnam and Sarah and many other hagiographical texts, place the buildings of churches and monasteries in the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, but in the majority of the cases, this is not supported by material evidence. This might simply be a matter of survival, and with new archaeological work, these chronologies may change. But for now, we should underline the discrepancy between the literary sources and material evidence. As we will see shortly, many of the so-called classical architectural forms are repeated in medieval Syriac churches, if sometimes in simpler articulations. So within this continuity, it is difficult to determine a starting point for Syriac architectural tradition. Moreover, many buildings changed hands between Orthodox, Catholic, Greek-speaking, Syriac-speaking, and sometimes non-Christian communities throughout their histories. So identifying a church as a Syriac church is sometimes problematic. Despite these methodological problems, we can identify a group of churches and monasteries as epitomes of Syriac architecture based on the criteria that they are built by or for Syriac-speaking communities, or they were used by these communities for an extensive time. We will now look at the major architectural features and other common elements of Syriac churches as a way of introducing the most prominent examples. Here are the ground plans of two early examples of Syrian Orthodox churches. As you will quickly realize, there are two orientations of the nave. The one on the left here is elongated on an east-west axis, while the other one rests on a north-south axis. This one has a tripartite sanctuary flanked by an apse flanked by two side chambers, while this one has a more complex side chamber, but both of these forms are actually quite common. Some of the apses in Syrian churches protrude, but it is more common that the eastern wall encapsulates the sanctuary in a way that we can't really tell the organization of the sanctuary from outside. The Church of Azaziel has an apse in its courtyard, right here adjacent to the church. These are open-air prayer niches that are called Beit Suluto, and they are again quite common in especially village churches in northern Mesopotamia. The first one of these churches, the Church of Mar Azaziel, looks like this in the interior. We see the arches built with ashlar blocks, and the sanctuary is decorated with a band of, with an ornamented band here. You probably can't see the detail, but it is quite intricate. And it has this cross relief on the conch of the apse. The church also has a bema, which was a feature seen in some of the late antique churches in Syria and Mesopotamia, but it was slowly dropped. So we can see this one as an architectural relic in this early medieval church. Under the blind arch here, there is a burial, and church burials are common in Syriac parish churches. In monasteries, while there are some church burials, a separate burial chamber called a Beit Kadishe is more usual. And one of the most decorated one of these burial chambers comes from the monastery of Mar Behnam, we've seen at the very beginning. This monastery was majorly rebuilt in the 12th century, but it is probable that it was built earlier, but we have no evidence for an earlier structure. Here we are looking at the monastic church connected to the burial chamber with an underground tunnel. Typically, these burial chambers have arched niches with burials, like in this photograph here. And you see that this burial that we are looking at is distinguished from the other ones. This is the burial of Mar Behnam himself. And it is distinguished with a mukarnas, a form well known from the Islamic tradition. And this brings me to the decorations of Syriac churches. The study of Syriac church decorations leads to questions regarding identity, tradition, and theology. Art historically speaking, different identifications are proposed for iconography and architectural sculpture, such as Greek, Byzantine motifs, Persian styles, or Islamic motifs, as we've seen at the burial of Mar Behnam. At the same time, it is important to ask whether a church decoration is simply following the local tradition. And if that is the case, what is the scale of that locality? Can we speak about family-based traditions, for example, or traditions of particular villages and towns? Or should locality be defined in broader terms, like North Syrian tradition? In addition to these questions, which are not easy to answer, the decorations are also analyzed with a theological approach, oftentimes. For example, figurative decorations are often a matter of debate. Figurative decorations are more common in Nestorian and Catholic Syriac churches compared to Syrian Orthodox churches in the Near East. For instance, Mar Behnam displays a rich decorative program, including figural decorations. At the gate of the two baptisms, these panels have these alternating patterns between floral patterns and the figurative pattern all along this gate. And each one of these figural patterns look like this example on the right. As I've mentioned, such figural decorations are not common in Syrian Orthodox churches, but there are important exceptions. For example, at the Monastery of the Syrians in Egypt, the screen that separates the nave from the sanctuary has similarly panels in which saints are depicted. On the very upper row here, there are 6 saints depicted, and one of them, for example, is this one on the right, Saint Severus. These decorations date to the 10th century when the monastery was inhabited by Syrian Orthodox and Coptic communities. Another interesting and well-known case of figural representations in Syriac space is the monastery of Moses the Ethiopian. The monastery is attested in literary sources as early as the 6th century, and its history has been partially recorded with rich inscriptions. It is one of those buildings the ownership of which changed multiple times. Formerly, it was a Syrian Orthodox monastery, but today it's Syrian Catholic. The decorations are, as you see here, very vivid, and they do depict biblical scenes, as well as prophets and saints. So it is quite lively and very, it has quite interesting details all over the church interior. And they are from the 11th and 12th century. And the inscriptions found at the monastery from around the same time period mentioned Syrian Orthodox patrons of the monastery for that time interval. So this is yet another exceptional space where the binary of iconophile and non-iconophile churches doesn't apply. There are, of course, portable icons today in Syrian Orthodox churches, and that might have been the case in the Middle Ages as well. But frescoes or reliefs depicting human figures are still rare in the Syrian Orthodox tradition. And this difference, as I've mentioned, is sometimes interpreted in theological terms by scholars. I will not dwell on this question for the moment, but perhaps we can talk about it in the Q&A. Despite not developing a tradition of figural decorations, monophysite churches display a rich variety of architectural sculpture, some of which are unique. For example, the Church of the Virgin in northern Mesopotamia, the ground plan of which we've seen above, is a one-of-a-kind building with its architecture and decorations. On the cubical roof that encapsulates the church's dome, there are these shallow niches marked by columnettes, and each niche is decorated with a relief, some floral and some zoomorphic. On the interior too, the church is spectacularly decorated. The niches on the apse here mimic the ones on the exterior. The ornamented bands mark the sanctuary, and it all culminates with this cross relief. The monastic church of Jacob the Recluse also has decorations not known from any other building. The sanctuary is demarcated by bands of carved vine scrolls, and the piers display concentric rectangular bands that end with a line of animal figures in the middle. Right here, these are identified as maybe doves or other birds. These ones are harder to see, but this decoration is just not seen in any other church in the region. These two churches, the Church of the Virgin and this one, Jacob the Recluse, are very close to each other, and they are almost contemporaneous. So I want to put a pin in here, and hopefully we can return to the question of unique details and what that might have meant for the communities. Syriac churches display an impressively rich variety of crosses. I'm showing here only a small fragment, and some of these patterns are very well known from Syrian churches. For example, this kind of roundel is very common, but others are actually unique. For example, this one, although probably this is an older cross, is size-wise, it is quite big, and it is very unique in its shape as well. It looks like these look like either wings or sunbeams. This one comes from a village church that is dated to the 10th century, and it is unique too. And this equal armed cross is perhaps not, perhaps it looks generic, but there is an Olaf here, if you can see, and the rest of the decoration is deteriorated. But I think this might be a Syrian re-articulation of the alpha and omega that is seen in many Greek crosses. And this is again a unique pattern from northern Mesopotamia. Some of the most elaborate examples of these crosses come from the outdoor prayer niches we've mentioned before, the Beit Suluto. These date roughly to 8th, 9th century, but stone is difficult to date, and unless there's an inscription, it is again almost impossible to date them to a particular time period, and they have been continuously carved in churches until the modern day. But I think these three crosses, and other scholars agree as well, that these three crosses are contemporaneous. They are quite early, 8th, 9th century, and they are all in these outside prayer niches, the Bet Sultal. In addition to the architectural sculpture, the churches usually have ornamented brickwork on their vaults, which should be cited among the decorations of churches. I'll give you just a couple of seconds to look at these very intricate decorations. Some of them look like floral patterns, while others are more generic, but almost all of the early churches, which are early medieval churches, have these brickwork in their vaults. So when we speak about Syriac churches, churches, monasteries, and adjacent buildings come to mind, like baptisteries. An important component of these buildings, however, is often overlooked. That is the rock cut spaces integrated into churches and monasteries in various ways. As we see in this photograph of the well-known monastery of Rabban Hormizd, rock cut spaces are often an extension of the buildings, and they are therefore indispensable for the study of Syriac architecture. In this photograph on the left, we are looking at the monastery of Jacob the Recluse from a hermit's cave. And this visual dialogue between the hermitage, the monastery, and the village is essential in order to develop a better understanding of the landscape used in Syriac buildings. This hermitage is one of the many chambers carved in the bedrock here. We see them lined up. And they house burials and small chapels. So these spaces were, and in many cases still are, active spaces. Here are three more rock cut spaces, just to highlight the importance of these buildings in the making of church spaces in the Syriac tradition. This one, again, might have been a little late. Please ask me a question about this. And fantastic rock cut church space. This one is a crypt under a village church. And this looks like an open air church. I don't know, I haven't excavated it, but I don't think it was ever covered. But the bedrock is covered in the shape of a church. We see the apse here and the niches on the two side walls. So all of these spaces are very much a part of our understanding of Syriac architecture. So now that we've overviewed, probably a little too fast, this interestingly complex and rich field, I want to present the main categories of sources available for the study of Syriac architecture. First of all, we have the buildings themselves that are, some of them are in use and some in ruins, as we've seen in some of the photographs, and some of them are lost and we only know them through literary depictions. And these, all of these three modes of materiality complicates the study of buildings in the context of Syriac architecture. We have quite a rich epigraphic tradition that complements the study of buildings. And there is a voluminous literary corpus that narrates building projects and buildings decorations, and they problematize and complement the study of Syriac architecture as well. We can also add other elements to this list, right, such as portable objects and other categories of study that can complement the study of Syriac architecture. Since each one of these categories would require their own lectures, I will give one example for each category. So this is a village church, and these two photographs, I've taken them, I think, 4 months apart or something like that. This is the first photograph, and the next time I went there, the church was undergoing a restoration, which was really great news. The brickwork was not uncovered back then, and it looked really spectacular, and the church was being cleaned up. But you see there's a burial here in the earlier photograph, and then that was removed when I went there the second time. So as these buildings go through these multiple phases of restoration and renovation, and as their histories unfold in these really exciting ways, all of these changes in these living buildings add different layers of complication to the study of Syriac architecture. For the inscriptions, I will give an example from the monastic church of Jacob the Recluse. Here is the sanctuary of the church. We are looking at the southern wall. And you can't quite see, but right next to this brickwork, there is actually an inscription. I'm showing this photograph just to see how just to see how difficult it is to see from the ground. Close up, the inscription looks like this. It is still not easily legible. And if we zoom in, it looks like this. It is a very invaluable document. It actually lists patrons who donated money to the restoration of this church in the 8th century. So we have the names of the donors. Many of them are lay people, and we have the amounts of money that they have donated to the church. So this kind of documentation is really invaluable, and in many regions where Syrian churches have been built are often quite rich in these epigraphic traditions. So this is an important part of the study of Syriac architecture. And for the literary sources, my example comes from an 8th century, maybe early 9th century text that narrates the life of Simeon of the Olives. He was the bishop of Haran, and he, according to his hagiographical tradition, he undertook many building projects. And these are the kinds of information we get from this text. For example, we read in one passage that he bought from a governor an old ruin outside the city gates of Nisibis, and he turns these old ruins to monasteries, dedicating them to martyrs in the region. He also built, as we read in the hagiography, a pillar for a stylite recluse. In another passage, we read about the struggles that he went through while he was undertaking these building projects. For example, before this passage, oh, my cursor stopped working. But before this passage, we read that he was building buildings and Nestorians wouldn't allow him to build, or they would tear them down. So he goes to the governor, asks for workers, and he attains workforce through such connections so that the Nestorians would not stop him. And in just yet another passage, we read that in addition to his building projects, his building churches and monasteries, he also built a beautiful masjid, and he built a madrasa for the Arabs. So all of these details are really exciting to read, and it is problematic when there is no archaeological evidence to match with them. So it is intricate linguistic work that should be matched with the archaeological work, but the literary sources are still very exciting and complementary to the study of Syriac architecture. In the remaining few minutes, I will talk about the history of scholarship on Syriac architecture. In the late 19th and early 20th century, a number of important archaeological expeditions laid the groundwork for the modern study of Syriac architecture. We should cite the Princeton archaeological expeditions and the travels of Gertrude Bell and the explorations under the British and French mandates post-World War I. These early works were mostly interested in documentation and cataloging, but they also introduced some of the important categorizations to the field. For example, the early works, these early 20th century publications, they discuss the distinctions between East and West Syriac churches, or the differences between parish and monastic churches. Gertrude Bell, for example, Here is her publication in revisited, revised, and republished in the 1980s. So Gertrude Bell, for example, observed that Syrian Orthodox monasteries in northern Mesopotamia usually rested on a north-south axis, while parish churches had naves elongated on an east-west axis. The generalizations are interesting, but other dynamics underlying architectural decisions need to be brought into the conversation. There were also categorizations proposed for artistic forms, such as classical, Persian, or Islamic styles. These categories and others have been revisited and nuanced by recent works. And it's really exciting to see these recent additions to the study of Syriac architecture. I have included only a few of the recent works here, but it's exciting to see that new questions are posed at Syriac material culture. The question of identities is receiving much attention. Scholars have also nuanced the concept of interreligious encounter and exchange. Previously, Christian-Muslim relations have been receiving much attention, but recently, Syrian-Armenian relations, Syriac-Georgian relations, like we see in Emma Lucy's recent book, for example, are exciting new additions to the field. And finally, we should note that the social history of buildings is situated with new theories and new material. And these works shed light on patronage, agency, personal choice, and other important concepts that have shaped Syriac architecture. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing your questions. I'm wondering if I'm over time or not. Nope, right on time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. And I know the audience can't quite be here in person, but I assure you everyone is applauding, and I'll give a brief applause on behalf of everyone else.
Thank you.
So, this was a fantastic lecture, and, just as a means of introduction, my name is Anuj, and I'm a second-year graduate student here at Stanford. And so I think, why don't we just go ahead and jump into a couple of the questions that we have. I would go ahead and I'm going to ask this first question here that I think is really interesting. There was an image of a church that someone pulled out that had a number of floral and geometric images kind of emblazoned on the ceiling. And someone kind of wanted to know, are these representations of the eye of God? I wonder, with the defined flat square or circle in the middle of the surface. So kind of the nature of the relief, I suppose.
Right. So can you remind me, Anuj, which church are you thinking of, or are you not speaking about one of the photographs that I've showed?
No, it was one of the photographs that you'd shown, and I think it was in reference to the ceiling having the number of those. One of the reliefs was a star relief, another one was more, I think, an ordinary relief where it was rectangular, and it was all kind of going inward. And if those were kind of maybe reliefs of the eye of God.
Yeah, I am not sure. That would be one of the theological readings of this church architecture and architectural sculpture. And I don't know. Of course, that is one of the, again, readings of one of the ways we can read this, but there are so many levels of decision making going into these, right? There are the local workmen who know certain traditions for generations, and there are the patrons whose personal choices and tastes go into these decisions. And there are those theological decisions which many ecclesiastical and many clerics, for example, would have liked to probably have in their churches. So when there are that many different levels of agencies and resources and decision making, I wouldn't dare to identify a church architecture as the eye of God, but I am sure there were many people who interpreted that way back in the day, and there are, of course, people still interpret it in those theological terms as well. That's a great question.
Yeah. No, thank you. And you know what? I'm going to steal a question that I'm kind of interested in here. Now that since I'm here with you, I'm really kind of interested in maybe the process of consecration. I think early on in your lecture, you kind of mentioned that churches were kind of built over maybe pagan temples or built maybe over another church. It was one of the first few things that you kind of mentioned. And what did the process of consecrating a church look like? Was there maybe some ritual to it? Was there some formalization of a process of constructing these churches? Yeah.
So for For prominent churches, like this one, for example, the Church of the Virgin in northern Mesopotamia, for some of these churches, we do have written accounts of the days that they were consecrated, and sometimes it corresponds to a saint's festival, sometimes not, and we do have these literary descriptions. But in many cases, actually, we don't. There are hundreds of village churches, for example, and we don't have any literary account as to when they were built, when they were consecrated, how they were done. They probably were, of course, consecrated at some point. So there's still a lot unknown in about the process between the beginning of a building project and the point the church opens its doors to the congregations. But that's again a great question, and there are some really detailed consecration narratives that are in literary sources. But again, I don't know how much of that is generalizable to every church that we know that has functioned at some point.
Of course, of course. Okay, so we're going to switch gears here a little bit and talk more about the kind of broad, like, overarching timeline of Syriac architecture. There's a question here that asks, is there a period of time that can be classified as a decline in Syriac architecture? Kind of maybe the lifespan of something like this.
So is the question asking whether particular churches decline after a while of serving, or in general, in the history of Syriac architecture, there is a decline in building, the amount of building?
Okay.
If you can just rephrase the question real quick.
Sure. Why? I think those are both great points, and if you have an answer for both of those, that would be
Let's go for both.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first one. So maybe the question would simply sound like, what is the lifespan of one Syriac church based on the examples that we know today? And so the examples that I've shown today, for example, this one that we are looking at right now, some of these have been standing and serving the communities for more than 1,500 years. And in that sense, there is constant renovation, restoration, revitalization of some of these churches, while others, of course, fall into ruins. And it will depend on the local circumstances, whether the community have survived multiple calamities or not, or other coincidences throughout the life of a building. So that is a little difficult to tell or generalize. Well, was there a time period in which the Syriac church architecture, Syriac church building historically declined? We know that, for example, between the 9th through, let's say, the 12th century, there is just less building activity in some regions. But there were also, at the same time, in that interval, there were many renovations and restorations. So there doesn't seem to be a complete stopping of church building. There have always been small scale projects, but the 8th and 9th century, for example, is just unequaled in their volume. So there are some periods where we see just more churches being built, but there is, of course, the later periods under the Ottoman Empire, for example, after the 16th century, that I am not an expert of. So there might be other small patches of time periods where church building declined. But for the Middle Ages until the 12th century, it is really difficult to tell because we constantly see this architectural activity.
Mm-hmm. That's great. That's a really thorough answer. Thank you so much for that. Okay, so I also want to now just take another shift in a different direction. Could you speak a little bit more about the interplay between Islamic and Syriac Christian architecture? I noticed that there were a number of decorations that were in similar, but if there's a little bit more that you have to say about that.
Right, I definitely can. So Islamic, we won't have time to have a mini lecture on Islamic architectural development here, but maybe the short answer to give would be starting from roughly the 12th century. We see many architectural elements that are closely similar between Islamic buildings and Syriac Christian buildings, especially in northern Mesopotamia, as well as in Mosul and other places that are closer to the centers of Islam. I will show you an example. This wasn't included, but I hope the remaining of my slides are in good shape here. There we go. So these are a group of Islamic buildings. As you see, this pattern, for example, the star pattern appears on these mukarnases, and these are all were built around 12th century, or it's all Islamic buildings. A rock cut church in northern Mesopotamia has this decoration here, and this is very similar to these patterns, right? We don't know, and Elif Keser has published on this rock cut building. If anybody wants to read, you can find it among her publications. And we don't know if this was actually built or carved by Muslim workmen, or it was basically an adaptation. We again don't know, but it is really strikingly similar to these patterns, right? So these kinds of comparisons are quite common. So we know that there was more than just superficial encounters. There were actually much more intricate artistic and architectural encounters between the two communities, as we read in Jacob of Simeon of the Olives' life, starting from 8th and 9th century. Probably many Christian bishops were building or participating in the building of Muslim buildings and vice versa. So the interaction, encounter, and exchange is actually quite intricate and ongoing throughout the Middle Ages.
Okay. And, I'm just going to ask kind of a related question here is, does the epigraphy of the buildings, do they change after the Islamic conquest? So is there a marked shift at that point?
What do you mean by epigraphy changing?
Well, the epigraphy or any style of the stylistic features or any marked element of these buildings or architecture shift after the Islamic conquest.
Yes, for example, Islamic calendars started being used in some of the epigraphy, and I have that too in my slides. I will show here. All of these decorations are coming from this village church here, and I have a publication coming up in a month about this church. So if anybody wants to read, you are most welcome. So in this church, there is this inscription that commemorates a certain Abu Yahya, whose name was Arabic, although he was a Syriac Christian. And this inscription is also dated with the Islamic calendar. Normally, Syriac inscriptions are dated with the Greek calendar, the Seleucid calendar, but this one is one of the earliest examples of the Islamic calendar being used from the early 10th century. Why in a village church? Why in this village church? We don't know. I have some thoughts about it, and we have been corresponding emails with Andrew Palmer and others about this building and others. So it is a mystery, but it is a beautiful mystery. And here it is, the Islamic calendar being used in a rural village church.
Wow. That was a perfect answer to that question. That was well done. That's amazing. So I did want to take now just a step back and kind of talk about the I think we do. Let me just double check the time. We have enough. You have so many questions, so I want to make sure I get to as many as I can here. One of the questions that was recently asked was by Linda Wheatley Irving, and I think she's asked, what are your thoughts on the use of caves, either in general or vis-a-vis specific caves for these types of architectures?
Right, Linda, if you are here, I'm so glad that you came today. My greetings. And actually, she would know more about the caves than I do, so I will not dare to answer this question in her presence. But as I've showed in these examples, let me just go back through these embarrassing slides here. As I've shown in these examples, these are quite interesting spaces and very intricately carved and very actively used. And some of them, like this one here, is right beneath a church. That's actually the church that I've surveyed. And Abuna Yakup Kurt passed away a couple of years ago, but he was a very hospitable man who used to stay at this church and dwell here and open its doors to everybody. So this one, for example, is beneath the church, this rock cut space, and it had small chapels as well as burials, and it had multiple entrances from different sides of the church. So quite an important space for the everyday religious practice at this church. Then it was blocked in a recent year, about 2 decades ago. This one, on the other hand, is far from many villages. This belonged to a monastic complex, and I know I don't have photographs of this one here, but if anybody wants to talk about this site, it's called Bahwar in northern Mesopotamia, and it's a fascinating site with these huge monolithic rock walls, and rock and stone masonry has been integrated into that rock cut architecture. There was probably a huge monastery here at one point, and this is one of those churches that was used at this site, but it is far from churches and villages. So what is this doing? For example, this open air church in the countryside is a great question. And these two rock cut spaces should be distinguished in terms of how frequently they were used and what purposes they served. This one is right in the middle. This is quite close to the village, about 10 minutes of walking distance from the village where the monastic church of Jacob the Recluse is, Salah. But this is also different from these two examples in that this site belongs to a really huge rock cut complex with multiple chapels, multiple story, multiple crosses, and other decorations. The decoration that I showed that looked like the Islamic pattern comes from this site. So this was probably carved over the course of maybe decades. There are many inscriptions. So this looks like a more actively used space than, let's say, this church here. When it's rock, it's very difficult to tell. So I'm really scared to say something wrong here, but I think there should be a huge project. And here is, an open invitation. I think actually Linda has been undertaking that project. So I'm curious about the outcomes, and I look forward to reading what she is writing about these rock cut spaces.
Yeah, me too, actually. That's really interesting. And so just kind of continuing on this vein, though, of the situation of these kind of locales, were there any of these, did any of these structures have some sort of acoustic function to them? Do we know if that's, something that was relevant? Is that, I mean, I know in other areas that is something that is a topic of discussion, so.
Right, absolutely. There is actually really exciting work done by I forgot. I apologize. I forgot his name. But the research is on Syriac music, Syriac liturgical music. I'm not going to forgive myself. But this is just me saying that there is that research done. I don't know exactly which churches are used to reconstruct Syriac liturgical soundscapes, but it's absolutely a new frontier of research, and both within the buildings, but also in the landscapes too, right? The church bell and other features in the landscape also contribute to our understandings of sound and how it was used both within and outside the liturgical context in Syriac religious practice. Excellent question. I'm just not the expert, and I really feel bad about forgetting the name of the expert.
No. I mean, you've been under rapid fire questions for about the past 15 minutes, but this does take us to the end of time for today. And again, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I know you're on the East Coast, so it's a little bit later for you. So really appreciate you coming out. And thank you so much again. This has been a great success.
Thank you. Thank you. This has been so delightful. Thank you for inviting, and thank you for all the questions. I couldn't see all of them, but maybe after the talk, I will read a few of them. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk to all of you. And I wish a great evening to everybody who was able to join us today.
Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for joining us.